November 28, 1953, somewhere between midnight and 2 in the morning, room 1018A, 10th floor, the Statler Hotel, 7th Avenue, New York City. The room is dark. The city below never fully quiets. Distant horns, a siren somewhere far off, the low mechanical hum that never really leaves Manhattan. 2 men are asleep. One of them is a CIA officer named Robert Lashbrook. The other is a 43-year-old bacteriologist from Maryland named Frank Rudolph Olson. Frank has a wife at home, 3 children, a mortgage, a dog, a Sunday routine. He has been in New York for 4 days under the watch of a CIA handler, seeing a doctor the agency arranged. He has been told this is for his own good, that he needs help, that everything is going to be fine. He is not fine. He hasn't been fine for 10 days. What happens next exists in exactly one account. Robert Lashbrook's, and then the sound of breaking glass, and then silence. Frank Olson's body was found on the sidewalk below at 2:30 in the morning. He had gone through the window head first, tearing the curtain on the way down. The fall was 10 stories. Nobody survives 10 stories. Within hours, the New York Police Department closed the case. Suicide. A troubled man, a long way from home, who couldn't hold on. The family was notified. A pension was arranged. The government sealed its files. And Frank Olson was lowered into the ground at Linden Hills Cemetery in Frederick, Maryland, mourned as nothing more than a man who had lost his grip. That was the official story. It would hold for 22 years. And when it finally came apart, what was underneath was worse than almost anyone had imagined. This is the story of Frank Olson, a man who worked inside the darkest program in CIA history, a man who saw things he was never supposed to see, a man who, the moment he considered telling the truth, was managed, isolated, and silenced in the most permanent way possible. Stay with me, because the horror of this story isn't that it sounds impossible. The horror is that it was policy. To understand Frank Olson, you have to understand the world he lived in, not the America on the surface, the shining post-war America of Chevrolets and picket fences and Eisenhower smiling from every television screen. That America was real. But beneath it there was another country entirely. One that operated without oversight, without accountability, and without much concern for the people it was supposed to protect. The year is 1950. World War II has been over for 5 years, and the United States has emerged as the most powerful nation on earth. But power, it turns out, doesn't bring peace of mind. It brings a very specific kind of terror. Because the moment you have everything to lose, you become capable of things you wouldn't otherwise consider. The Soviet Union had detonated its first atomic bomb in August 1949, 4 years earlier than American intelligence had predicted. China had fallen to Mao Zedong that same year. The Korean War ignited in 1950. And in Washington, in the halls of power, where men spoke in low voices about things they could never write down, a conviction was hardening. The enemy wasn't just at the border. It was inside, in the universities, in the laboratories, maybe inside the intelligence community itself. It was this atmosphere of institutional paranoia that produced MKULTRA. In April 1953, CIA Director Allen Dulles officially authorized the program that would become one of the most disturbing chapters in the history of American power. Its premise was as simple as it was terrifying. The United States needed to develop the ability to chemically destroy a person's free will, to break a man open and read what was inside, to create, if possible, a human being who could be directed like a weapon. The declared enemy was Soviet intelligence. But the program, from the start, aimed its experiments at a much wider target. At the dark center of MKULTRA was a molecule, colorless, odorless, nearly weightless, synthesized accidentally in 1938 by a Swiss chemist named Albert Hofmann while developing a circulatory stimulant. Hofmann absorbed a trace amount through his fingertips one afternoon, rode his bicycle home, and experienced what he would later describe as a world that had come entirely undone. Colors breathing, sounds with visible shapes, the boundary between himself and everything else simply gone. The molecule was lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD. The CIA believed it might be the key to everything, and Frank Olson was already deep inside this world before the program even had a name. Frank Olson was not a spy. He was not a soldier. He was not some shadowy operative groomed from birth for covert warfare. He was a bacteriologist from a small town in Wisconsin. Born on July 17, 1910, in Hurley, a hard-luck iron mining town near the Michigan border, Frank was the son of Swedish immigrants. Smart, quiet, methodical. The kind of man who found genuine comfort in the logic of a laboratory, in the precision of data, in problems that had real answers. He studied bacteriology at the University of Wisconsin, earned his Ph.D., and in the early 1940s was recruited into the one institution where those skills were suddenly in extraordinary demand: Fort Detrick, Frederick, Maryland. If you've never heard of Fort Detrick, that's not an accident. It was the United States Army's Center for Biological Weapons Development, a place that officially existed to protect Americans and existed in practice to find the most efficient ways of killing them. Behind its fences, scientists worked with some of the most lethal organisms on Earth: anthrax spores, botulinum toxin, plague, tularemia. The work was classified at the highest possible level. The purpose was war. And in the logic of total war, the rules that governed ordinary science, informed consent, the line between research and harm, the basic principle that human beings are not experimental equipment, simply did not apply. Frank joined during World War II and was good at the work. Very good. When the war ended in 1945, he could have left. He could have returned to academia, to the clean, transparent world of published research and peer review. He had a wife, Alice, whom he'd married in 1943. He had children. He had a comfortable house in the suburbs of Frederick, the kind of house that in 1950s America represented everything a man was supposed to want. He stayed anyway. By 1950, Frank had risen to lead Fort Detrick's Special Operations Division, the unit responsible for the installation's most classified research. He traveled regularly to Washington. He attended meetings with no paper trail. He knew things that were designed to be known by as few people as possible. He was exactly the kind of person the CIA needed: brilliant, loyal, cleared, and already accustomed to working in the dark. What nobody told Frank, what nobody tells anyone when they step willingly into that machinery, is how much harder it is to step back out. The MKULTRA program ran more than 150 separate research projects, funded through front organizations and shell companies, so the money could never be traced back to the CIA. It involved at least 80 institutions, universities, hospitals, prisons, military installations, most of which had no idea who was ultimately funding the work or why. The scientists conducting the experiments were often brilliant, credentialed, respected in their fields, and they were completely willing to set aside every principle of medical ethics they had ever been taught. At its core, MKULTRA was a search for something that had never existed: a reliable method of destroying a person's resistance without their knowledge. The CIA wanted to know whether you could chemically break a man's will, whether you could make someone confess things they intended to keep secret, whether you could erase a specific memory, whether you could, in the most extreme version of the question, program a human being to act on command, without their knowledge, without their consent, without any possibility of refusal. LSD became the program's most promising instrument because its effects were so total, so completely impossible to fight against. A person dosed without their knowledge could be rendered incapable of coherent thought within 30 minutes, could experience hallucinations, absolute terror, the complete dissolution of the boundary between self and world. In that state, the agency theorized, a subject could be guided, manipulated, broken open in ways that more conventional techniques could never achieve. They tested these theories on prisoners in federal penitentiaries, told the tests were medical studies, on patients in psychiatric hospitals who had signed forms for entirely different procedures, on soldiers who volunteered for what they were told were experiments on chemical defense, and on foreign nationals in CIA safe houses overseas, men whose names were not recorded, whose fates were not documented, and about whom no one was ever going to ask questions. Frank Olson was not a passive observer of this program. He was an architect of parts of it. He helped design delivery mechanisms for airborne biological agents. He understood at a technical level very few people possessed how these substances behaved inside the human body. And sometime in the early 1950s, he began traveling to Europe, to West Germany, to CIA facilities operating under American military cover, where the experiments had left the laboratory entirely. What Frank saw in those rooms in West Germany was not research. It was application. Prisoners, captured operatives, suspected communist agents, men with no legal recourse and no one waiting for them anywhere, were subjected to substances that had never been ethically tested on human beings. Some of those sessions were lethal. The men did not survive. Frank Olson watched that happen. He went into those rooms as a scientist. He could not leave them as the same person. And for a time, a year, maybe more, he tried to carry it alone. Then Deep Creek Lake happened, and the weight became something he could no longer hold. November 18, 1953. A retreat house on the shore of Deep Creek Lake in the mountains of western Maryland. Dense forest, cold water. The kind of silence you only get when you're far enough from a city that the world forgets you're there. A small group of CIA scientists and officers had gathered for a working weekend, an off-the-books review of ongoing programs. The kind of meeting that exists in no official record because it was never supposed to. Frank Olson was among the attendees. On the evening of November 19th, Sidney Gottlieb spiked the drinks. Gottlieb was the CIA's chief chemist and the operational architect of MKULTRA. He had a PhD in biochemistry from the University of Texas, a clubfoot, a pronounced stutter, and an absolute, unshakable conviction that the security of the United States justified any means that science could devise. MKULTRA was his creation, his obsession. In many ways, it was his life's work. That evening, Gottlieb poured LSD into a bottle of Cointreau being passed around the group after dinner. He waited 20 minutes. Then he told the room what he had done. This was, by the standard of any law that has existed in any civilization, a serious crime. But inside the operational logic of MKULTRA, it was simply another data point. The agency needed to observe LSD's effects on unwitting subjects in an uncontrolled social environment. These men were the environment. That they were colleagues was, apparently, beside the point. Most of the group reacted with dark humor, wrote out the effects, and eventually slept. They filed their internal reports. They went home. They did not speak of it publicly for decades. Frank Olson did not write it out. In the days that followed Deep Creek Lake, Frank became someone his colleagues barely recognized, withdrawn, unable to sleep, eating almost nothing. He spoke in fragments, stopped mid-sentence, stared past whoever he was talking to. A man who had always operated with clinical precision now seemed to be standing at the edge of something he couldn't see the bottom of. Not from the LSD itself, which would have cleared his system within a day, but from something the drug had cracked open. Some interior pressure that had been building for years and now had a seam to push through. He went to his closest friend at Fort Detrick, a fellow scientist named Norman Cournoyer, and said he wanted out. That he needed to leave the CIA. That there were things he had seen, things he had done, that he could no longer carry without telling someone. Cournoyer would say, decades later, that Frank used the word murder. In the machinery of Cold War intelligence, those words were not a cry for help. They were a detonator, a man who wants to leave, who is psychologically fracturing, who witnessed lethal experiments on prisoners in classified facilities overseas, who holds the highest clearances the government issues, who is now talking to a friend, maybe soon to anyone who will listen. The CIA had a name for situations exactly like this, a security problem. And security problems, in 1953, did not get resolved with severance packages and thoughtful conversations. The CIA did not cut Frank Olson loose. That would have been the merciful option. Instead, they kept him close. They told him he needed help, psychiatric help, and arranged for him to see a doctor in New York. The doctor's name was Harold Abramson. On paper, Abramson was a well-regarded allergist with a practice on Park Avenue, the kind of doctor whose name sounds reassuring, whose office you imagine full of diplomas and leather chairs and the calm authority of someone who knows how to fix things. In reality, Abramson was a CIA contractor who had been involved in the LSD research program from its earliest stages. He was not equipped to treat someone in genuine psychological crisis. He was equipped to manage someone whose psychological crisis had become a liability to the agency that employed them both. On November 24, 1953, Frank traveled to New York under the escort of Robert Lashbrook, a CIA officer who would remain at Frank's side every single day until the morning Frank's body was found on the pavement. They checked into the Statler Hotel on 7th Avenue. Frank saw Abramson. Then again the next day. Then again. On the surface, the session seemed to be working. Frank called Alice back in Maryland, told her he was feeling better, that he'd be home soon. His voice sounded almost normal. He was not better. He was not even close. In the evenings, Lashbrook watched Frank grow more agitated, not less. One night, Frank walked out of a Broadway show in the middle of the first act, unable to sit still, unable to bear being enclosed with strangers. He told Lashbrook he wanted to go back to Frederick immediately, that night. There are accounts, fragmented and disputed, of Frank saying things in those final days that suggested he understood his own situation far more clearly than he was supposed to, that he felt followed, watched, that the people around him could not be trusted. Whether those perceptions were the symptoms of a mind collapsing under the weight of what it had endured, or the entirely rational observations of a man who understood exactly what the CIA was capable of doing to a security problem, that question has never been answered. On the night of November 27th, Frank and Lashbrook returned to room 1018A and went to sleep. Then, according to Robert Lashbrook, the only witness, Frank woke, crossed the room in the dark, and went through the window. The NYPD arrived to a scene that told a simple story. Shattered glass, a torn curtain, a body 10 floors below. Lashbrook was present, composed, cooperative. He had already made 2 phone calls before the police took his statement. The first was to the hotel front desk. The second, before calling Alice, before calling any family member, before calling anyone whose name suggested anything other than an institutional chain of command, was to a number that investigators, years later, traced to a CIA office in Washington. The man who answered reportedly responded with 5 words. Well, that's too bad. Frank Olson's death was ruled a suicide before the sun came up. Alice Olson was told her husband had killed himself. She was 38 years old. Her son Eric was 9. Her daughter Lisa was 7. Niels, the youngest, was 5. The government arranged a pension. Neighbors brought casseroles. The community of Fort Detrick, bound by the same culture of secrecy that had consumed Frank's life, said the things that people say at times like these, and then went permanently quiet. For 22 years. That was the entire story. Then came 1975, and the Senate investigation that would crack the architecture of post-war American intelligence open like nothing before or since. In the wake of Watergate, which had already shattered whatever remained of the public's trust in its government, Senator Frank Church convened one of the most consequential congressional inquiries in American history. The Church Committee was charged with investigating abuses committed by the CIA, the FBI, and the NSA. What they uncovered went further than almost anyone had anticipated. Internal CIA documents revealed MKULTRA in full. The scale of it, the institutional reach of it, the fact that American citizens, psychiatric patients, prisoners, soldiers, and their own employees had been subjected to drug experiments without consent. The fact that people had died. The fact that a cover story about a depressed government scientist who had jumped from a hotel window had been constructed, maintained, and protected for over 2 decades. In July 1975, President Gerald Ford invited the Olson family to the White House. CIA Director William Colby arrived in person with a stack of classified documents and handed them directly to Alice Olson and her grown children. The President of the United States apologized, formally, in person, for what his government had done to their husband and father. The government paid the family $750,000. And then, with the efficient patience of an institution that has survived many scandals, it waited for the story to go away. It didn't. Because Eric Olson had read the documents. And the documents, for all they revealed, did not explain how his father had died. They confirmed the LSD dosing. They confirmed the concealment. But the finding of suicide still stood. The window was still a window. Room 1018A was still just a room. Eric was 30 years old. He had the rest of his life ahead of him, and he was going to spend every useful minute of it pulling that story apart. And her son Eric was left to grow up inside that story. There is a particular kind of grief that belongs only to people who grow up without knowing how someone they loved actually died. It doesn't soften with time. It calcifies. It becomes structural. Part of how you see the world, part of every relationship you have with authority, with institutions, with official versions of anything. Eric Olson was 9 when his father didn't come home from New York. He was 30 when the government admitted it had drugged his father and covered the death, and he spent the next 5 decades trying to find out exactly what happened in room 1018A between the moment Frank fell asleep and the moment he landed on 7th Avenue. Eric earned a PhD from Harvard. He became a psychology professor. And alongside that career, quietly and then not quietly at all, he became something else entirely. The most relentless private investigator the MKULTRA story has ever produced. He filed Freedom of Information requests by the hundreds over decades. He tracked down surviving colleagues of his father. He hired attorneys and forensic specialists and contacted journalists who were willing to go where official bodies wouldn't. He built an archive that became one of the most comprehensive private collections of CIA mind-controlled documents in existence. In 1994, he made the decision that required the most of him. He petitioned the courts to exhume his father's body. Frank Olson had been in the ground for 41 years. The forensic examination was led by Dr. James Starrs, a professor at George Washington University, a man with no connection to any intelligence agency, no stake in any particular outcome, and a reputation built on reading physical evidence without sentiment or agenda. What Starrs found was not consistent with a suicide. Frank Olson's skull bore a severe blunt force hematoma on the left frontal region, a targeted localized contusion that simply did not fit the pattern of a fall from height. A 10-story fall produces distributed trauma across the body. The force of impact spreads on contact. What Starrs found instead was a discrete, focused injury to the front of the skull. The kind of injury produced by a single, concentrated blow. The kind of injury that renders a person unconscious. The kind of injury that, if inflicted before the fall, would mean Frank Olson did not go through that window under his own power. Starrs stated his conclusion in plain language. Frank Olson's death was, in his professional judgment, a homicide shrouded in circumstances of culpability. Not a suicide. A murder. Staged. Committed by someone who was in that room. In 1996, Manhattan District Attorney Robert Morgenthau opened a formal criminal investigation. The first time in 43 years that a law enforcement body was treating the death of Frank Olson as what the evidence suggested it was. But investigations need witnesses. They need documents. They need living people willing to tell the truth under oath. The witnesses were dead, unreachable, or silent. The documents had been largely destroyed. CIA Director Richard Helms had ordered the bulk of MKULTRA's paper trail shredded in January 1973, 2 years before the Church Committee would have found them, as if someone understood exactly what was coming and precisely how much time they had. Robert Lashbrook spoke to investigators. Nothing he said resolved the central question. Sidney Gottlieb, the architect of everything, died in March 1999. His last public statement was a vague expression of regret for actions he could not bring himself to name specifically. In 2002, the Manhattan DA's office closed the case. Insufficient evidence for prosecution. Frank Olson remains, officially, a suicide. That word, officially, is doing an enormous amount of work in that sentence. Here is the question that sits at the absolute center of this story. Why Frank Olson specifically? MKULTRA involved hundreds of people. Scientists, officers, administrators, contractors. The vast majority of them lived out comfortable, unremarkable lives. They are buried in ordinary cemeteries and no one is investigating how they got there. Why was Frank Olson a problem serious enough to require a permanent solution? The answer points to something beyond the laboratory work. Beyond the Deep Creek Lake dosing. Beyond a man simply questioning what he had participated in. It points to what Frank had seen in Europe. And what he had told someone he was about to do about it. Between 1950 and 1953, Frank made multiple trips to West Germany under classified orders. He visited CIA facilities operating under American military cover, installations where the research developed at Fort Detrick was being applied directly to human subjects in operational settings. Not studied, not theorized about, applied, on prisoners. On men who had been taken from the world and placed in rooms that did not officially exist, to be tested with substances that had no approved use, by scientists whose names never appeared in any public record. Some of those men died. Frank watched that happen. And then he came home. And then he watched it happen again on the next trip. And at some point, exactly when is not in any document because the documents were destroyed, something inside Frank Olson began to give way under the weight of what he had witnessed. Norman Cournoyer confirmed years later that Frank had spoken to him directly about what he had seen, that Frank told him he had watched men die in those rooms, that it wasn't research, that it was killing, that he couldn't carry it in silence anymore, that he was considering going outside the CIA, not to a foreign government, not to an enemy, to a journalist, to a congressman, to someone who could put it on the record before the record could be closed. In the CIA in 1953, those words were effectively a death sentence. Investigative journalist H.P. Albarelli Jr., and who spent nearly a decade on the Olson case for his 2009 book A Terrible Mistake, concluded, based on declassified documents and interviews with former CIA personnel, that the decision to eliminate Frank Olson was made at senior levels of the agency, that the Deep Creek Lake dosing was not merely an experiment in unwitting LSD response. It was the opening move in a deliberate process designed to destabilize Frank psychologically, render him unreliable, and create the conditions under which his removal could be presented as a breakdown. A man is dosed without his knowledge, then placed under constant watch by a CIA officer, then sent to a CIA-connected psychiatrist with no real ability to help him, then found dead below a hotel window, ruled a suicide before any investigation can begin, and buried before his family has time to ask questions. That is not a chain of coincidences. That is a method. There is a tendency, in stories like this, to become so absorbed in the machinery, the programs, the agencies, the forensic findings, the investigations, that you lose sight of what sits quietly at the center of all of it. A family. Alice Olson raised 3 children alone after November 28, 1953. She accepted the story she was given because she had no reason and no means to question it. She was a widow in 1950s America, and the government had been generous, as governments go. She lived with the official version for 4 decades. She died in 1993, 1 year before Frank's body was exhumed, 1 year before Dr. Stars found the contusion that changed everything. She died without knowing what the physical evidence of her husband's death actually said. That is not a footnote. That is the full cost of impunity. An entire life shaped around a lie that the people who told it never answered for. Eric has described growing up inside a government cover story as something that doesn't arrive as a single wound. It comes in installments. Each new document is another one. Each contradicted version of events is another. Each court that declines to pursue the case is another. He said in one interview, "My father didn't die once. He died every time the story changed." As of this recording, Eric Olson is in his 80s. He still lives in Frederick, Maryland. He still maintains the archive. He still speaks to anyone willing to sit with the full weight of what the evidence suggests without looking away from it. He has said with the particular steadiness of a man who has spent 50 years thinking about one thing, that he does not expect legal justice. He expects instead to ensure that enough of the truth is on the public record that it can never be completely buried again. That is both extraordinary and devastating in equal measure, that a man's life's work should be the reconstruction of his own father's murder. In 1977, CIA Director Stansfield Turner appeared before the Senate to testify about MKULTRA. He confirmed the drug experiments on unwitting citizens. He confirmed the deaths. He confirmed that Richard Helms had ordered the records destroyed in 1973, and that what remained was only a fraction of what had actually occurred. No one went to prison. No one was charged. Sidney Gottlieb retired to a farm in rural Virginia, where he raised goats and studied folk dancing. He converted to Catholicism in his final years. He wrote letters to some of his victims expressing generalized regret. He never named Frank Olson specifically. He died in March 1999 at the age of 80. His New York Times obituary ran on page B9. Frank Olson was not the only one. Harold Blower, a professional tennis player in New York, died in January 1953 after Army researchers injected him with a mescaline derivative without his knowledge. Not a treatment, an experiment. He never consented to either. Elmer Allen, a black man from Kentucky, had a radioactive isotope injected into his leg by researchers working alongside MKULTRA. At the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, Dr. Ewan Cameron erased and attempted to reprogram patients' personalities using months of drug-induced unconsciousness, electroshock, and looped audio recordings played into their sleeping minds, techniques so extreme that the CIA eventually stopped funding him, not on ethical grounds but because the results were too unpredictable to be operationally useful. All of these people were used, many were permanently destroyed. Almost none of the people responsible faced any legal consequence whatsoever. That is not an accident. It is the architecture of impunity, built deliberately, piece by piece, through classification, the destruction of records, and the institutional protection of individuals whose exposure would have brought entire agencies down. It worked. It worked for decades, and in the specific matter of who killed Frank Olson and on whose authority, it is still working. The building where the Statler Hotel once stood is gone now. The Hotel Pennsylvania, as it was renamed in later decades, was demolished in 2021 to make way for new development. In its place, construction fencing, scaffolding, the indifferent forward motion of a city that doesn't stop to mark what it tears down. No plaque was installed before the demolition, no memorial, no record anywhere on that ground of what happened on the 10th floor in the early hours of November 28, 1953. The city did not pause. The building came down. The pavement where Frank Olson's body landed is still there, beneath the feet of everyone who crosses it today, carrying none of the weight of what it once held. The documents that would resolve this case, if they still exist, if they survived Helms's purge in 1973, remain classified. Releases come occasionally through Freedom of Information requests. Each one offers fragments, a name, a date that contradicts the previous version. The center of every truly revealing document is always blacked out, a solid bar where the answer should be. Robert Lashbrook, the only witness to Frank Olson's final hours, died in 2014 at 93. He spent his retirement in Pasadena, California. Over the years, he spoke to journalists and investigators. He never changed his account in any substantive way. He maintained until his death that Frank had jumped, that it had been a tragedy, that he had done nothing wrong. Whether that was the truth, or whether it was a story a man had told himself so many thousands of times it had become indistinguishable from memory, that question left the world with him. And Frank Olson lies in Frederick, Maryland, beneath a headstone that gives his name, his dates, and nothing else. No mention of Fort Detrick. No mention of the rooms in West Germany. No mention of what Dr. Stars found inside his skull. No mention of the son who dedicated his life to telling the story his father died before he could tell himself. Just a name. Just dates. Like every other grave. That is how institutions erase people. Not always with violence. More often with patience, with paperwork, with the slow, quiet replacement of a man's real story with a simpler one that serves the people who need it to remain simple. Frank Olson's story is not a conspiracy theory. That is worth saying plainly because the phrase has become a mechanism for closing conversations before they start. What happened to Frank Olson is documented. The CIA drugged him without consent. The United States government admitted that at the White House to his family with the president present. In 1975, a forensic scientist found physical evidence of blunt force trauma inconsistent with a fall. A Manhattan district attorney opened a criminal investigation. These are not suspicions. They live in public records, congressional testimony, and published forensic literature. What remains unknown, what may never be officially confirmed, is exactly who gave the order, what happened in room 1018A in the hours before dawn, and how many other Frank Olsons exist in files that were never opened or were destroyed before anyone could read them. Frank Olson was not a hero in the simple sense of that word. He was a man who worked willingly for years inside a program that caused serious harm to other human beings. He made choices that he then spent the last months of his life trying to undo. He was not innocent in the full sense of that word either. He was something more complicated and more human than either of those things. A man who found the edge of what he could live with and tried to turn back, and ran out of time before he could. He was also a father, a husband, a person whose death was arranged, covered, and officially closed before the people who loved him had any chance to ask what had actually happened. His son has been asking for 70 years. If this story sits with you after this video ends, if it makes you uncomfortable in the way that true things do, in the way that keeps pulling you back, then it did exactly what it was supposed to do. Because the truth about Frank Olson doesn't resolve. It doesn't arrive at a verdict, a sentence, a moment where justice reasserts itself and something like peace becomes possible. It stays open. It stays unfinished. The window is still broken. The file is still redacted. The grave is still unmarked. And the people responsible died in their beds. If this is the kind of history that won't let you go, the history that was deliberately kept from you, the stories that powerful people spent decades and enormous resources trying to ensure you would never hear, then you are in exactly the right place. Subscribe. Turn on notifications. Because next week we go somewhere just as dark. There are more names like Frank Olson, more cases like this one, more files that were designed to stay closed forever. We are going to keep opening them.